Hello! In our last video, we looked at the origins of Sparta and talked about how Sparta conquers its neighbors in order to gain land, specifically the Laconian plain and the Messenian plain, and then how it sets itself up as a society of essentially three classes. The Spartan citizens who live in Sparta and own estates in Messenia, the Laconians or perioiki, who are free non-citizens who do a lot of economic work in the state and live in Laconia, and then the Helots, who are the native Messenians who work the estates of the Spartans and are slaves to them. Now, when we think of Spartan society, though, we probably think of a very militaristic society. And Sparta has not quite become that yet, even with these big conquests under its belt. So how does that emerge? Well, it really emerges because of what is known as the Second Messenian War. So the First Messenian War, Sparta conquered Messenia. The Second Messenian War happens beginning around probably 669. Again, it's hard to do exact dates. But around 669 BC it seems to have erupted. And it is a revolt of the Messenian Helots from Spartan rule, or at least an attempted revolt. It starts because Sparta was fighting one of its neighbor polis in the Peloponnese, a place called Argos. It had recently been defeated by Argos, and the Messenians saw that as a chance to revolt, right? They saw that Sparta was in a weakened position, and so they attempted to revolt and to free themselves. They are ultimately defeated. Sparta reasserts its power. But at this point, they seem to realize that they are in a very difficult position because the Spartan citizens are outnumbered wildly by the number of Helots that live and work in the region. Probably as much as 7 Helots to every Spartan. And this is a bad place to be. You are surrounded by your own slaves. They outnumber you greatly, and you want to be able to defend yourself in case this rebellion happens again. You're not going to give up your slaves, certainly, if you're the Spartans. Instead, you're going to figure out a way to defend yourself. And so what the Spartans do is they institute a sort of a reorganization of their society that is now focused upon allowing all Spartan men to focus their lives on military service so that at any moment Sparta is ready to provide a very strong response to a possible slave revolt. And so we will see now that Spartan men from birth, really, are trained to become, to excel as warriors and to be very sort of group-minded, to put the state before themselves at all cost. Now, these kinds of reforms are later attributed to a man named Lycurgus, who supposedly was told them by the oracle at Delphi, right? So it comes from the gods. But of course, this is one of those myths that the Greeks make up to legitimize the way that they do things. All right, so I mentioned before that after Sparta conquers Messenia, they divide the land up and give it to their citizens. So they divide Messenia into 9,000 plots of land, which corresponds to 9,000 plots. To about how many Spartan men there were at the time. And so then each Spartan man is assigned 1 plot of land. And so that land is his, the Helots who live there are his, and the Helots work that land and produce goods, and that supports the Spartan and his family, right? So he doesn't have to do any work whatsoever. His land is his, it's given to him by the state, and it just produces enough wealth to support him and his family, okay? So that is assigned to all Spartan men from birth, in fact, right? Even baby boys are given a plot of land so that they will have something to support themselves throughout their life. So when a Spartan is born, one of the first things that happens is that they are examined. There are government officials in Sparta whose job is to examine Spartan babies and to decide if that child is strong enough to live and to make a good soldier. And so if there's any kind of deformity or any sense of weakness, that child is exposed, essentially left to die. And exposure is not just a Spartan practice. This is practiced across Greece, across the ancient world, in fact. It's not uncommon for people to expose babies, especially ones that they cannot support or that seem to have some kind of disability and will make it difficult to raise them. But the Spartans do this on a government level rather than on a family-by-family level, so that's what makes it a bit more unique. And the government's involved because they are specifically trying to create essentially a very strong military force out of their men. All right, so The boy then lives with his family for the first few years of his life. Around the age of maybe 6 to 8, he leaves to enter the state training program called the Agoge. Okay? And so it's just men. Women have their own training program. We'll get to that in a moment. But they leave their homes and they join the Agoge. And they are placed in groups according to their age, right? So you're in similar age groups with other Spartan boys. And you are then trained. And the training is not just military necessarily. It's not just putting a sword and a spear in your hand and teaching you how to fight and how to make formations and tactics and all of that. It's also about making you tough. So these boys are made to endure hardships. They are forced to walk around barefoot. They are given just one cloak a year, and so they often have to sleep cold. They have to make their own bedding materials and use those, so that it's often rough to sleep. They are given very simple foods and sometimes not given enough food and encouraged to steal what they need. All sorts of practices that are meant to make these kids tough. Right? And uncomplaining. They're willing to accept orders. They're willing to accept hardship. They're willing to accept whatever is thrown at them. And so they're trying to really inculcate discipline, a kind of toughness, obedience to authority, a group cohesion. They want them to form an identity where they feel very connected to their fellow Spartans, and so that they will consider the group to be more important than themselves as an individual. And then along with this, yes, military skills. They have to know how to use a sword, to use a spear, to fight together in formation, and all of this. So the first few years are really devoted to training these boys in this way. They will eventually enter real military service and see battle, but not until they're a little bit older, in their later teens. Now, at the age of 20, they enter what is known as a syssition. We sometimes translate this as a mess hall. It's not a great translation. Or a dining company or something like that. It's a group of about 15 men. It's a kind of unit that you join once you're 20 years old. And you live with these men in a kind of barrack situation, and you eat all your meals together with these men. So it's giving you a kind of focused group that you form really, really close loyalties with. And so these men are your constant companions. You sleep in the same barracks as them, you eat with them, you work together with them, you train with them, all of these kinds of things. So every Spartan, when they reach Spartan man, when they reach the age of 20, they enter into one of these mess halls, the syssition. Right? At this time, they can technically marry. They can get married. They can start fathering children, all of that stuff, but they can't go live in their own home. They have to keep living with the other members of their syssition. And so what we're told is that these men will go out and they will meet women and sleep with them and marry them and father children with them, but those women will continue to live in a separate household and raise their children in a separate household, while the man will live in the barracks with his fellow soldiers. It is not until he reaches the age of 30 that he can live in his own household. So you could be a Spartan man, and you can hit the age of 30, and now you leave behind your syssition in the barracks, and you go and live in a household, which again, you have an estate somewhere in Messenia that is all yours. So you have a household. You may have had a wife for 10 years at this point. You could have like 9 and 10-year-old children at this point as well that you've never lived with and don't know very well. In fact, you could have fathered a son, and he could have already entered the Agoge by the time you get to go live in your home. So the family relationships are not the closest for this reason, and they're not meant to be, right? Your loyalty is to the state, not to your family necessarily. And so from 30 to 60, as a Spartan, you continue to be first and foremost a soldier. You will fight when you need to fight. You will train when you need to train. You do not have to engage in any kind of economic activity. All of that is taken care of you on the estate by the helots. Your focus is on military preparedness and then also civic duties. You go and you vote in the assemblies and stuff like that. We'll talk about the government structure in our next video. So this is the life for a Spartan man. It is fully focused on warfare. If you make it to the age of 60, you can retire. And once you hit the age of 60, you no longer have any military obligations. You still will get involved in the government, and you still don't have to engage in any kind of economic work, right? The estate continues to be yours and to produce goods for you, but you don't have to do any military service at that point because you have aged out of it. All right. So that is the life for a Spartan man. What about a Spartan woman? This is another thing that's usually notable about the Spartans. They have this tradition that women in Sparta live a very different life than women in any other part of Greece. And we're going to see that women in Greece have very oppressed lives, right? There's a lot of rules about what they can do, who they can see. They don't have any real legal rights or political rights or anything like that. But women in Sparta seem to be a bit better off. So for women, for men, their duty is the military and government participation. For women, the only duty that is expected of them is to bear children. And so in this sense, they're not different from other Greek women. All Greek women are expected to marry and to bear children for their husbands, especially sons. But the Spartans accommodate this in a way that other groups don't. So for one thing, Spartan women have their own training program. I don't think it has a name of its own, but they receive training, especially athletic training. And the idea is to create women who are strong, who can survive childbirth, and who will bear big, strong sons as well. So they have athletics and gymnastics training as part of their childhood that is set up by the state that all these Spartan women, these Spartan girls go to. They do not have any domestic duties, is another thing. Most Greek women have to make sure that the house is cleaned, they cook the food, they create all the fabrics, all of these burdens fall on them. For the women, they live on these estates that belong to their husband or their father, and they have a whole slew of helots who do all that domestic labor. The helot women do all the cooking and cleaning and all those normal duties. So they don't have to engage in any kind of domestic labor either, which is supposed to free them up and keep them strong just for childbearing and raising these kids until they're ready to go to the agoge or until they're women who can marry on their own. Right. Some other things that are notable, women marry at an older age on average in Sparta. In the rest of Greece, you might see some marriages as young as like 13 or 14 years old. For Sparta, they don't think women should marry until like 20, which is much more reasonable. And they do this because they say, well, a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old will die in childbirth most likely, which is true. A 20-year-old is actually ready to bear children. Her body can handle it. And so they encourage later marriage. Another result of this is that Spartan women tend to be closer in age to their husbands because they start to marry at the same time, whereas in a lot of the other parts of Greece, you get these like 14 and 15-year-old girls marrying 30-year-old men, and there's a humongous power imbalance that affects the dynamics of that relationship. So for Spartan women, they're a lot closer in age as well. There are also stories about some other strange marital practices, including wife sharing and things like that. And we'll do a reading and we'll discuss that more in class, how likely these stories are, or if they're just kind of these fictions told by outsiders. But in general, women seem to be in a better position in Sparta. Now, of course, there's also all the helot women and perioiki women, and their lives are probably closer to what other Greek women's are. But for Spartan women, they hold a special status, right? And there's also talk of them wielding more power, and that is only true to a certain extent. Because they kind of run estates without a husband until their husband can come live with them, and because men are frequently away on war, women have to do a lot of decision-making on their own, on their estates, but they don't actually have a say in government. They don't attend assemblies, they don't vote or anything like that. It's more that within the household, they wield an incredible amount of authority because their husband is frequently not available. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention here is one issue that Sparta does run into, and that is a population decline. This is a problem that plagues Sparta. So, the population of full Spartan citizens in the Archaic period was supposedly 9,000 men. And we said, okay, Messenia got divided into 9,000 plots, and then you gave one plot to each man. Now, this, by 244 BC, this number is 700 men. It's an incredible decrease. And the issue is, it's multiple. There are multiple issues going on. The level of infanticide that's happening in Sparta, where they're killing off babies that they do not think will make good soldiers, is high enough to impact the overall population. They do not allow anyone to join their city, right? It's almost impossible to become a Spartan citizen if you are a perioiki or a foreigner who just wants to move to Sparta. That's just not allowed. So there's no influx of immigrants into the city. Some people have said, well, they have less opportunities for conjugal sex, right, for having sex with their wives, and that will impact the birth rate as well. And that may be a factor. I don't know how much of one it is. There's also just the issue of what they do with the land. So ideally, for the Spartans, what should happen is that when a Spartan man dies, his estate goes back to the state and then gets assigned to the next baby boy who is born. And this seems to have been the practice early on. But it doesn't take too long before people begin to try to hold land privately. And not only that, when they hold private land, they're then sending it down to their own sons, and that's going to mess up the system. But not only that, but women are allowed to inherit land. This is another thing that women really have over other Greek women, which is that they get an inheritance. It's 1/2 of what their brothers get, but they still get to have land that they can control. And so if some of this land is going to women, then there's not as much to give to men. And if some of this is being held in families, then it can't get spread out to all sorts of people among the Spartan citizens. And so land becomes less available. And so since the ability to be a Spartan citizen is tied to owning land, if there's not as much land going around, you can't have as many citizens. So their population decline is also very much an issue of this distribution of land and the way that this ideal system that they have of a kind of a communistic system of the land really belongs to the state and gets sent out and lent to these citizens breaks down pretty quickly. Okay, so that's it really for our overview of Spartan society and kind of the lives of Spartan men and women. In our next video, we'll look at the Spartan government. All right, thanks for watching.